I should introduce myself. I'm Joanne Richards, and I'm the president of the board of Common Ground for Texans. And I'd like you to welcome you all to today's event. We've asked several people to give us a perspective on the consequences of our election, both at the national level, the state level, and the local level. And Mike Ignatowski, as usual, will be the moderator of our discussion. I do want to take a moment to let you know that we will meet again on Saturday, December 12th, and we're going to do things a little bit differently. We're going to take a look at a 20-minute TED Talk by Jonathan Haidt called The Moral Roots of Liberals and Conservatives. It's a 20-minute short talk, basically based on his book called The Righteous Mind, but it's quite humorous. And after we look at that 20-minute video, we will break up into groups and discuss what we see there, and then come back to the group as a whole and give our comments. For those of you who've been involved in Braver Angels, this is a typical kind of thing that Braver Angels might do. So it'll be very much along that vein. But we will send an email to everyone. We certainly wish that we could be visiting face-to-face. But unfortunately, COVID-19 is still with us. Libraries are closed, and we all need to be safely distanced from one another and stay safe and healthy. Without further ado, let me introduce Mike Ignatowski, who will talk a little bit about how we're going to work today.
Well, thanks, Joanne. So I'm Mike Ignatowski. I'm your moderator, and I want to say good afternoon to everyone on this last weekend before Thanksgiving. And judging by the amount of Christmas decorations that have been going up in our neighborhood, people can't wait for the end of 2020 to happen. So we just finished an extremely important election. Many of you, probably like me, had a hard time imagining what life would be like after the election and decisions were made. But here we are. This is today the second week anniversary of the major networks declaring Joe Biden the presumptive projected winner. But it wasn't a complete blue wave at all. The Senate, as we probably all know, is up for grabs based on two more runoff elections happening in January. And state has not changed a whole lot. Local elections for city council still has 2 seats undecided, which will be decided later in December on runoffs. So it's not clear what the long-term implications of all this are, but we do have 4 panel members who will come and talk about it today. The usual process that we're going to follow here is to have the panel members each take 5 or 10 minutes to give us their thoughts on the results, the impact of the election, whether that's city, state, national, or some combination of all those. And then we'll have an informal discussion among the panel members and myself, and I'll bring up a few other questions. And then we'll open it up to audience discussion. And if you have a question you want to ask the panelists at really any time during this meeting, type it into the chat window and it'll go straight to Hamilton Richards, who will collect these questions and then read them off when we go into the audience question time. If there's any other questions, problems, technical issues, again, just type them in the chat window. They'll all go straight to Hamilton, and he'll do the best to take care of them that he can. So without further ado, let's start with the panel members giving their thoughts. We thought we'd start with a broader perspective. And with that, I'd like to welcome Ashley Lopez from KUT News. Ashley, if you could take 5 or 10 minutes, give us your thoughts on the implications of the election. You have to unmute yourself.
Can you all hear me? Yeah, sorry. So my computer died in the middle of all this. I'll at one point restart everything. But who knows what happened. Anyways, I'm Ashley Lopez. I'm sure you guys got a better reading while I was a better introduction while I was scrambling to turn on my iPhone for this. I cover mostly state politics and healthcare, which obviously are two big issues this year. But from the election perspective, like the thing that I think are the big takeaways is I want to start with like turnout. So Texas historically has had some of the worst voter participation in the nation for many years. And, this year we did see a quite significant increase in people voting, which is very exciting. This is something that people who work in, civic mobilization groups have been working on for years. And, it was very promising, especially during early voting, to see so many people voting. And what we've learned so far, we do not have like a full picture of who voted and where yet. That kind of more granular data is going to take more time to get. It's, I assume in the next few weeks we'll have a better picture, but, we do know a lot more young people voted, more people of color voted in Texas. And ultimately, even though, what we learned is even with more people voting, our politics kind of turn out the same, right? Republicans held on to power in both the Texas House and the Texas Senate, which was surprising for Democrats because they had high hopes of flipping the Texas House. In 2018, they had flipped 12 seats and they had their eye on 9 more that they thought could give them a majority in the House and therefore some power in state politics. But that didn't go that way. Some of those races were close, but for the most part, that ended up being largely unsuccessful. Many of those seats were lost, almost all of them. And so, what I think is interesting is even though politics kind of looks the same, turnout looked differently than it had, in the last few years. Texas still, even though we had such an increase in voting, Texas still remained kind of bottom on the list nationwide in terms of turnout. And a lot of that is because, other states did a better job still than we did of expanding access to the ballot. Other states expanded, mail-in ballots during the pandemic for obvious reasons. And Texas officials decided not to do that. So I think we're still in the bottom 5, last time I checked, of states in terms of voter turnout, if not bottom 10 for sure. And now moving into knowing the political reality, which is, Republicans are still going to control the major levers of government. What I'm going to be watching as a reporter is, how they respond, how, both parties respond to the economic situation we find ourselves in, with the sort of political reality we're in right now. We can talk more about this later, but I think what seems to be the preeminent choice for House Speaker is really interesting. I think it signals there could be some bipartisan cooperation in dealing with what's going on in the state. The rise in uninsured rates are really concerning. I'm assuming that's something they'll have to solve in some way. And that's pretty much it. I don't want to, I'm sure, the other panelists have other things to add, but from a state perspective, that's what I'm interested in seeing and watching, and what I think is the sort of big questions that overlay what happened in November.
Okay, great. Thanks, Ashley. Next up will be Barbara Rodriguez. So Barbara is with the 19th News, which is a nonprofit, nonpartisan newsroom reporting on all the gender, politics, and policy. Barbara's actually coming to us from Iowa right now, I believe. So Barbara, if you could unmute and give us your thoughts on the election.
Sure. Hi, can everybody hear me all right? Okay, great. Thank you for the introduction. And again, my name is Barbara. I'm the State House's reporter for our newsroom, and can't help but want to plug that our journalism is available for free at 19thnews.org. This election, I was keeping an eye on local, state, and congressional races. And I think I went into the election really looking at what role women would play in voter turnout. I think in part because, you know, there's been this narrative around women following the 2016 election. You know, they marched in the streets following the election of President Donald Trump. They ran as candidates in the 2018 midterm elections. There was polling that indicated a growing gender gap in terms of the support that Vice President Joe Biden, now President-elect Biden, would receive from women compared to President Trump. And I think that the results, the takeaway for me was that it was a bit more complicated than that narrative that women of every demographic would overwhelmingly reject the president. I think women were a crucial vote for Biden, you know, specifically Black women, some women of color in key battleground states, and suburban women. But I think that President Trump still, you know, continued to receive a lot of support from white women and white women without college degrees. And I think that speaks to his strength as a candidate and the strength of the Republican Party in terms of their, you know, strength with those voters. And so, you know, I think, you know, I think my understanding is that early data really shows that the gender gap remains similar to not only 2016, but other presidential election cycles. I think, you know, another dynamic that stood out for me as a national reporter was the role of women as candidates, particularly in congressional elections. You know, there will be at least, I believe it's 141 as my last checking, women in Congress next year. And that's a record. You know, that includes at least 117 in the US House of Representatives and 24 in the Senate. And that's obviously partially due to the fact that more women than ever ran for Congress. You know, the previous record was set in 2018. But I think Republican women had a really good night. And, you know, they're going to double their representation in the House, where we all know they were down to 13. And, you know, I think Republican women of color also helped with some of those flips, which I think showcases their potential political power in the future. You know, I think obviously the big news of the night for me as a national reporter was the election of Kamala Harris as the first woman vice president and the first Black Asian American woman to ascend to the second highest office in American politics. That's huge. And there's still, you know, pending data on state house races, which I follow closely, but it was a good night for Republicans. You know, they maintained their majorities in chambers around the country. That's going to prove really crucial if Congress is headed toward gridlock, obviously with the potential for divided government, depending on the US Senate runoffs in Georgia. I have a couple of other, you know, things I'm thinking about. You know, obviously there were some historic firsts in local races around the country for women of color. So I was keeping an eye on that. And I think the other thing that I followed closely was, obviously we have this really decentralized election system. And I think that the power of women who run those elections were really front and center. You know, they helped power poll workerships. They helped run elections administration and local races around the country. And they were, again, front and center as secretaries of state in key battleground states, and especially in the days following election night in terms of fighting off disinformation. You know, they just proved crucial in challenging sort of the narrative around the security of elections. And so lots of different things that I'm thinking about, but those are some of them.
Great, thank you, Barbara. Next up, we have is our state representative, Sheryl Cole. She's the representative for House District 46, which encompasses parts of Austin and Travis County. And I believe she was successfully elected to her second term, right?
Yeah.
Great. Sheryl, your thoughts?
The stakes could not have been higher. in the state of Texas. I mean, the national election played a part, but we even thought that we might have a new president that won the state and the whole state might go blue. We have been targeting we had 12 seats to defend, which we had gained in 2018. So people forget when we talk about flipping the House that we had a lot on the line because those seats had been won by a relatively small margin. And so we had to keep those. And then we targeted 9 to 12 more seats than that. And we ended up with no net gains. We flipped a seat in Houston that was held by Sarah Davis to a Democrat, Ann Johnson, and we lost one Democratic seat, Gina Kanani. So we had a net 0 gain. Now, I'll tell you, the night of the election, having put so much into flipping the House, because we have been talking about it, and the HDC, the House Democratic Caucus, had raised a significant amount of money from all over the country in the efforts to flip the House. There were so many Democratic organizations that contributed to that effort. And really, it's oftentimes overlooked that the House members are the ones that contributed to that campaign. And so all of us gave significantly to that campaign and were very, very vested in it because, I mean, we were going to be on the direct line in terms of changing our legislation if we actually flipped the House. So the night of the election, we were focused on flipping the House. And it was approximately 9:30, 10 o'clock before it started to look like we weren't going to do that. And by 11 o'clock, the phones were ringing with Republican contenders because they knew they were going to have the majority. Now, I joke and say, you know, I could have probably went to sleep on Donald Trump and Joe Biden knowing that it wouldn't be decided for, you know, a couple of weeks at most because it was so close, but I couldn't go to sleep on the Speaker of the House race. So there was no rest and the phones started ringing. I have never, well, you know, since it was on my second session, but we had a new speaker last time. So I had participated in a speaker's race before, but nothing where you flip from thinking you're going to change the representation of the House of Representatives to 2 hours later when you're electing or talking about electing and pledging to a new speaker, and that speaker is going to be Republican. So there was just no time to digest that information, and it was a real shocker to be going into. So people were calling, and it became evident that it was the time to try to garner support from the I mean, they didn't necessarily have to do that, but they were reaching out to, because of the split and because of the politics. And I think if the election had, we often like to say we didn't win and be sad, but if the election had not been as close as it was, I don't think the efforts by both the speaker candidates to garner Democratic support would have been as fierce as it was. It certainly wasn't that way last time. And they knew that they had to have a majority of the Republican caucus, but they reached out to the Democratic caucus. And I think that was largely because it had been so close. And I ended up talking to the speaker at 2 o'clock in the morning, the speaker-elect now. So the phones were ringing all night long trying to garner support. Now, the result of not having a gain and a Republican majority is that now we have the speaker-elect is a Republican. But the pledges to him on the first round of support that he received were 83 people, 50 of which were Republican and then about 33 were Democrats. And so that split was significant. So we know right off the bat that it's not going to probably end up as a Joe Strauss speaker who had more Democrats than Republicans, but he is a speaker that's indebted to a fair amount of Democrats for bringing him to his president-elect status. Now, the Speaker of the House is the second most powerful, some will argue with this, but the second most powerful member in the state of Texas because they control the legislation. They appoint all of the committee chairs and pretty much all of the committees, except for people who have seniority and they're able to keep some of their seats. But all of the major committees, local and consent, calendars, the flow of legislation are all speaker appointments. So the Speaker of the House is the most important because he controls the legislation of the House, and that's just one person. And also, he will be a vote on the Legislative Redistricting Board. Now, that's not talked about a lot, but the Legislative Redistricting Board is a member, has the Attorney General, the Land Commissioner, the Lieutenant Governor, the Speaker of the House, the Comptroller. And other than the Speaker of the House, they are all elected at large, and they are all ours. So it was real important to get a person who had some Democratic support in that position. So I'm glad that we have that, but still we lost it to all ours. And the only thing I will say is that that lineup of ours tend to be very split. I like watching them, and they look more divided than us, and they beat up on each other more than we do. So that's a comfort in that. And so I think the speaker will end up being one of the swing votes in the items that come from redistricting that go to the Legislative Redistricting Committee. So we had an eventful night. We were not successful, but we made very big gains in the increment. So the tide is still looking like we still have a shot at gaining seats, and the money was spent on gaining increments of votes that they were just smaller margins that the Republicans won by. There was a total of 11,500 votes total that we lost by as Democrats. So it was close. Thank you, Mike.
Thanks, Sheryl. I wasn't aware of this before, but is there a sense among the Democrats that you folks get to kind of pick the Speaker of the House?
We don't get to pick them. The majority party always gets to pick that they're going to be Republican. The question really is always what the split will be. Even if we had flipped the House Democrat, if all the Republicans had banded together, which they tend to do, and that's one of the rules of their caucus, is that they go into the Republican caucus and decide what speaker they're going to support, that person would have had a chance, could have likely had more Republican support than Democratic support if all the Democrats had not gone together. So it's all a big timing game and who you know. I mean, it's clearly a situation where the Speaker of the House is the most personal vote that you will cast and the one that is most critical to your career while that person is a speaker.
It sounds like you clearly have an influence on which Republican gets to be speaker.
Yes, you do, because we're not elected, the speaker is not elected as they do in Washington, where the person that is the party that has the majority of the seats does not go into a caucus and the speaker elected by that party. Both sides get to vote on the speaker. So the split is real important, and the makeup is real important into who has the speaker's support.
Great, thanks. That's good to know. The last panel member is our Austin City Council member, Leslie Poole, who just won her election this month. And now is to face or deal with council where there's still 2 members up for a runoff. And as I understand it, the people running against them both campaigned against the city's action on defunding the police. So Leslie, what's up for the city council coming in this next term?
Well, I want to make 2 comments about at the state level, if I might, and 2 regrets that I think one of them for sure is Sheryl, who's a longtime friend. Hey, Sheryl. And I probably share is Sophronia Thompson was lining up to be speaker. if the Democrats had been able to flip the House here in Texas, we would have seen some additional groundbreaking changes if Representative Thompson had, if the Democrats had won it and been able to voted in a speaker, that would have been awesome.
We're getting, Leslie, we're getting a lot of static from your mic. I don't know if you're moving it around or what.
Oh, I'm not. Is that better? Is there still static?
Keep going. It sounds good now.
Okay. Well, and the second piece is I managed to get elected to be a presidential elector. And I was really looking forward to going down to the state capitol in a couple of weeks and casting my vote to confirm as a presidential elector to the Electoral College, Joe Biden and Kamala Harris. And so that's a huge personal regret. And then I'll just continue by saying that I think Trump is worse than we thought. And the Republican Party has him to answer for. And at the same time, his predations and his depredations show us how resilient our country is, even in the face of all that we are going through, not just in the last 2 weeks, which is extraordinary, but in the prior nearly 4 years, the resilience of our country. And so I'm hopeful for the return of some nobility, some empathy and statesmanship at all levels of government, but primarily in Washington. And I think we've got a fighting chance with Mr. Biden and Ms. Harris. Closer to home, I'm really grateful to live in a city, in a community that can take a licking and keep on ticking, as that ancient Battery ad put it so many years ago. Locally, the council responded really comprehensively and quickly to the situation we're in. We acknowledged the public health crisis that we're in. We took rational, pragmatic action in response. We're continuing to take rational, pragmatic action. The city staff pivoted so adroitly. Some cities haven't. Some are responding late, but Austin was quick to recognize and respond to the public health crisis. And I will always, always be proud of that. We didn't dither. As a city, we didn't dither. Lives were and still are at stake, and we didn't look away. And you can't say that about all levels of government. So I'm really, really proud, not only to live in this community, but also to be an elected official. Because I know that when we were called on to do important and careful work, we didn't look away.
Great, thank you. I want to remind people that you can submit your questions into the chat window at any time, and they'll get brought up later in the discussion. But now, after those opening thoughts, we have a general informal discussion among panel members and myself. And I just had a couple questions to get things rolling. First one is, what's going to happen with the legislature this year? We're supposed to go into session in January at the height of a COVID epidemic happening. And I guess this is kind of to Sheryl Cole. Do you have any idea what is going to happen with the functioning of the state legislature this year?
We have no idea. I mean, we've heard a lot of things. We're fortunate to be in Austin, and we can actually meet other places beside the Capitol. So there's the Irwin Center, there's the Palmer Center, there's the Convention Center, and some of those have been discussed because they're larger and we can practice safe distancing. There's also been some talk that we may only consider the budget or the budget first and go into special session for everything else, hoping that there is a vaccine. We know that we will be required to generate the volume of less legislation than we will, just because we won't be able to handle it if COVID is still alive and well, and we know that it will be. Our offices, we will probably not have drop-by visitors. There won't be tours of the Capitol with the second grade class of almost every elementary school in the state. It just won't have the same flavor. Most visits will be scheduled, and they will be with major stakeholders that have legislation pending. So as far as the practical effects, the lobby is busy learning all of our cell phone numbers. I hear there's a premium out on that. So that'll be a big change. We'll be hearing from people more directly.
Thank you. I also had a question for, I'll put this out as a general question to the panel members. What happened to the expected blue wave in Texas? Why did it not materialize? Any thoughts on that? Who would like to go first?
You know, I'll go ahead and jump in, and maybe some of the national reporters with the more of a meta view, because I was pretty much focused very much locally. I will say that watching and knowing how hard it was to motivate people to go to the polls, to get over 150 million people to go to the polls, that was massive. That was a massive undertaking, and it was pretty shocking to me to recognize that fully 73 million of those, just shy of half, actually wanted to continue with the administration in Washington, when it was very clear to me how destructive that that administration is to all of the protocols and the norms and the rules and just the social accepted social behaviors that makes for a civil society and the breakdown of civil society. And I'm worried about where we will be over the next couple of years as all of these sands kind of shift and settle, where we will be. That particular outcome surprised me. So both the massive activation that occurred, but then how it separated out into two groups. I didn't expect that part to happen. I am, I guess, just a darned optimist, and I really did think we would have better outcomes with regard to the Democratic Party winning more seats, certainly into Congress. That's a real shame that some of the Central Texas seats weren't flipped. You know, we live to fight in 2 more years, and I hope that we do.
Go ahead.
I'll just jump in as a way to like kind of take some pressure off Democrats. I think those state house seats and those congressional seats were drawn up by mostly Republicans to favor Republicans. So, you know, I think it's like a point that's been largely lost, which is, you know, these were always going to be hard seats. They were designed to be favorable to Republicans. And the reason why these have become competitive is because in those 10 years since they've been drawn, just more people have moved in, and that has changed the dynamics of what those districts look like. But I think, you know, what Democrats ran up against is just how good people are at redistricting these days. We just have really good data on how to, you know, carve up districts to favor a party over another. And the Supreme Court has said over and over again, hey, that's totally fine. Jump in, you know, gerrymander that district to favor your party. It's not unconstitutional. So I think like that's important context, you know, as Democrats are like kind of, you know, beating themselves up. I just wanted to jump in with that point.
If I might jump in too, you know, all I was going to say is that I think that there's still a lot of internal soul searching playing out over what happened, not just in Texas, but in other parts of the country where Democrats had been hopeful that they could flip several state house chambers in areas like Florida, North Carolina, here in Iowa. And, you know, to Ashley's point, there is the dynamic of what impact redistricting has had over some of these districts. Also the conversation over what role, you know, the presidential race had on down ballot races and split ticket support for maybe Biden, but then Republicans, you know, down ballot. And also the fact that we're in the middle of a global pandemic and what kind of effect that might have had on canvassing and you know, different races and different candidates approach that differently. And I just think we are still waiting for a lot of data about all of that. But I just wanted to highlight that, you know, I think there's a lot of soul searching happening amongst Democrats, and not just Texas, but other parts. And then also, I just really want to quickly go back to that point about sort of what happens with like the Texas State House in terms of, you know, coming together once the next legislative session starts. I also just want to highlight again from that national perspective that it's a conversation playing out, you know, all over the country, because different state houses have different rules for when they are meeting amid the pandemic. And a lot of them passed a lot of temporary rules about, you know, proxy voting and like virtual meetings. And I think a lot of them are trying to figure out, well, what comes next with the next legislative session? And I think it raises a lot of really important questions about, you know, transparency for the public in terms of their ability to come and speak, you know, over proposed bills, but also for, you know, women in the state houses and working parents of small children and those who take care of elderly parents and grandparents. And, you know, there's like a real dynamic here of what kind of accommodations state houses are going to have, or leadership in these state houses are going to, you know, have for their respective caucuses. And it's kind of, I don't know if it's unprecedented, but I mean, it's real questions that need to be figured out in the next couple of weeks.
Great. So Barbara, you kept mentioning soul searching there. So let me expand the question a little bit. What about the claim that it was all those radical leftists on the Austin City Council who motivated Republican voters all over the state of Texas? Anybody want to comment on that?
Back to Barbara's point, we still don't have enough data to prove any of that, first of all. I also want to note, Republicans just did more during the pandemic. A lot of it is because they didn't take the pandemic as seriously as some Democrats did. You know, a lot of the door knocking, the stuff that really gets Democratic voters out, that didn't happen. And, you know, I think it's hard to ignore that fact. You know, I talked to voter mobilization groups on both sides, and Republicans were just kicking Democrats' butts all through the pandemic, especially in the summer. That kind of stuff matters. And so when it comes to like issue-based stuff, the number one issue was was either Trump or the pandemic, depending who you were talking to. So, you know, the kind of small stuff, I'd be curious to see what kind of exit polling we get. But as of right now, I think anyone who can make like, I'm really interested in hearing what people think is their gut reaction. But I will say, like, to say one way or the other definitively, we still need weeks of like district level data and census tract data to like, and better exit polls, which are never really all that great. So that's like, I would, as a reporter, like not attribute anything like that yet.
And I have to agree with what Ashley's saying. I think if I had been able to get out and meet with the electorate like I had on my last two campaigns, and I mean, I won, and I won pretty big, but it would have been different. It would have been more of a vote on the two of us who were running in the race. So I had to rely on my incumbency and the relationships that I had established previously, but I wasn't able to reach some of the first-time voters because I didn't know where they were. And normally they would come to an event, or we would be knocking doors and finding them. And so for me, and I knew that was a weakness going in from the very beginning that I was just going to have to face, and in some ways just hope about that my record over the last 6 years was strong enough to withstand that sort of not being able to reach people and not really knowing who they were, and being able to have the one-on-one conversation. So there's so much that we acquire about a person's values and personality, and truly whether you want to trust them. And we get that from our face-to-face conversations, and especially over time. And a lot of it is missing in this even the gallery view, you know, just it doesn't translate the way it does in a town hall that's in person, where you can walk around the room and shake hands and talk to people and reach down and speak to a little kiddo who might be there with the parents. Can't do any of that this way, but the humanity is kind of subtracted out. And so I think we work overtime to kind of pull it back in. But I knew going in that that was going to be the hardest part of the campaign this year. And again, had to come to terms with there wasn't a whole lot I was going to be able to do about it, because I wasn't going to ask people to come out in person and meet, because I personally didn't think that was the safest role to take. And I still feel that way.
If I'm able to jump in here too, also preface that we still need more data on all of this. I think it's particularly an interesting narrative around state house races, because I know at least, here in Iowa, and I suspect all over, all politics is local, and a lot of people want to see their, potential representative or senator or whatever the makeup of the state house is. And it makes a difference in that sort of anecdotal sense that, I know a lot of, particularly women, lawmakers who won in 2018 in some suburbs here in Iowa, who, knocked on every door in 2018, and there was a sense that it made the difference. And so, I think I'm really curious about sort of what more information will come out on that front. Because I also know that there were organizers for Democrats that did a lot of phone banking, but it just wasn't the same in terms of just reaching a lot of busy signals and people who didn't want to talk. And is this just sort of an anomaly for this moment, given the fact that, again, this all happened in the midst of a pandemic? And I think the other thing I want to note is that, depending on who you ask in terms of moderate Democrats or progressive Democrats, however they define themselves, they have very different thoughts about the conversation of sort of what, might have led to the moment that they're in right now, where they didn't get the wins that they wanted. But there's a sense from some progressive Democrats that Democrats need to do more in terms of talking about what they stand for versus just maybe the idea that they were against, the president. And I think I'll just keep repeating the fact that we just still don't have a lot. There's obviously people that are kind of pointing to some of those things, and some, especially on the congressional level, but yeah, I don't know.
Okay. Feel free to speculate. I mean, no one's going to hold you to anything here, but I tell you what, I want to ask kind of one more big question, and then open it up to the audience questions. So it's Ham, you're getting a quick morning here. Basically, I want to start with Leslie Poole. If you can quickly list what you think are the top 3 or 4 issues the council will be wrestling with this term, then I'm going to go to Sheryl and ask the same question about the state legislature this term.
So 2 really big things that we're going to be wrestling with is the continuation of COVID and how that continues to manifest itself, and the processes that we put in place on that, and then the budget, which we will be working on in about 5 months. And we were surprisingly able to bring in the general revenue budget at 3.5% revenue increase, which was the new cap that the legislature put on us last year. I was pessimistic that we would be able to do that, but we did it. And then we were able to, through the COVID funding through CARES, that made a big difference in getting us through fiscal 20. I'm not so sure, and into fiscal 21, I'm less optimistic about fiscal 22, and that's the budget we'll be working on in about 5 months. So budget and COVID.
Sheryl.
It's actually 3. The budget is the same because of COVID. And then 2, I think we'll be dealing with police issues because of the George Floyd Act. The Black Caucus is bringing that, and then the police defund issue, which kind of happened with, I'll give Austin some credit for bringing that to the statewide level, and know that we're going to have to deal with that. And then 3rd is redistricting. It's just a year to draw those lines all over again. And we've got the census information, probably get that late. I don't know what part of the session we'll do. It's wide speculation that we'll have a special session, but redistricting.
Okay, thanks. Ashley, Barbara, any other comments there?
And I'm not speaking to Texas specifically at this moment, but I do want to note, again, as a national reporter overseeing kind of state house dynamics going into the next legislative session for a lot of different spaces, I've been pretty curious to kind of see how some state houses have begun to maybe even challenge the ways in which, governors are dealing with the pandemic. And so there's a lot of like friction over sort of local control. I think when the pandemic hit in March, there were some state houses that were coming in and were, they sort of just froze in place, and then kind of came back and approved their, respective budgets. And now they're going to come back in, and I get a sense that they're figuring out what level of control they want to give in terms of response with public health. And like, I'm thinking specifically right now about Ohio that has a session right now, and they're talking about restricting some of the power of the governor and the Department of Public Health in terms of, what kind of restrictions they might have for the public. And I think that kind of played out a little bit in Wisconsin as well. And so, I'm just looking at sort of those kind of trends. And I think that ties in with a pandemic.
Yeah, and I mean, in conjunction with that, I'm sure this is number 4 for Representative Cole, but I don't know how the state of Texas doesn't address its coverage issues, its uninsured rate after this. It's only ticked up in the past year, and hospitals are already slammed with patients, and they're slammed with more patients that can't pay. And I've heard hospital administrators tell me, I don't know how the next 5 years are going to look if we don't change our payer mix, because right now, with our Medicaid waiver, which pays for a lot of uncompensated care, that's slowly trickling out that pot of money to help hospitals with the care that they provide to people without insurance. So, I mean, I'd be really interested to see how Texas handles that. We're like one of the few states that hasn't used federal money to expand coverage. It doesn't have to be Medicaid. Other states have taken that money from the Affordable Care Act and bought private insurance for people. So that's kind of what I'm watching too.
Great. So I want to turn over to Ham Richards to ask audience questions. I'll just remind the panel, the election is over, so you can say what's really on your mind here.
I think Leslie had a comment.
I was just going to say that maybe in response to what Ashley was saying about the Medicaid waiver, maybe this is actually the year that the legislature allows that to pass. It doesn't make any sense for Texas to leave that money on the table, and it's a significant amount of money.
Thanks.
Okay, I'll just take the questions in the order in which I received them. First one's from Joanne Richards. If there's a new stimulus that includes dollars for the states, how might Abbott use those funds? Who wants to jump in?
Well, he's definitely going to be forced to use those for COVID deficit, which is dominating, but also the school financing is not done with. There was a lot of one-time expenditures, and I think he'll receive significant pressure to do that.
Yeah, I would agree. I think the governor has to step up and fund the public schools. He did keep, what was it, $5 billion? How much was the COVID pay to the state for schools? And that was kept at the state level. It was not distributed out to the public schools, and it was used against the deficit. I'm going to say $5 billion, but I'm sure that's not the right number. It was maybe hundreds of millions of dollars, but it wasn't, none of the school districts got any of that money, which I think is really deplorable.
Yes.
Inexcusable.
Anybody else want to comment on that one?
I guess I could comment on that one, and that's the nature of block grants. If you give the governor discretion with the block grant, then often the money doesn't get distributed.
Next question is also from Joanne. She really jumped in early. How far right or moderate are the new Republican women in Washington?
Sure, I think, it remains to be seen a little bit. There's already some, a little bit of attention that some new members of Congress have received. I'm like making sure that I got her name right. Marjorie Taylor Greene. I think that's the name. I want to make sure I was double checking that one. But she hasn't been sworn in yet, but she's gotten a lot of attention on spaces like social media for how she's talked about masks and, and sort of the conversation over government oversight. And I think that she may be a reflection a little bit about sort of this idea of, maybe some of the Republican women going into the new Congress. And at the same time, again, I think there are also more moderate Republicans coming into the new Congress as well. Like, it's just a matter of, what goes around the echo chamber that is social media and spaces like Twitter. I think, there's still space to kind of see how all of these different women will lead in the new Congress. And so I feel like I have a bit of a reservation to kind of see what policies they present, what type of bipartisanship they have. I think that there are some Republican women in general, not even just Congress, that I think are getting a lot of attention, and whether there's some extension of what constitutes the future of the party without President Trump.
What will be the likely priorities of the speaker, assuming that it is Representative Phelan?
Well, I think it will be the same. I mean, they'll be forced just because of the state of Texas to focus on the budget. And he will probably focus on, the issues are coming ground up. I think he will get probably pulled in more to the police accountability funding issue than a normal speaker would have. And I expect him to care a lot about health coverage.
Anybody else? Next question is actually mine. Does anybody think that the blue wave may have just been postponed until the 2022 midterm election?
Well, considering Joe Biden won, usually the party that wins the presidency does not do well in the midterm after. So it's more likely Democrats will fare worse. But I think also, I don't know, I also wonder how much the Lege works on issues like ballot access and voter issues. This election brought up a lot of conversations around how we hold elections, and that has proven to change how and who votes. If looking at Georgia, it is not like a coincidence that part of the reason the state flipped was at a year when more people were forced to vote by mail. And, that just kind of like making voting easier tends to change, how people vote. Not always, how I guess parties fare. That's not always true. In Texas, everyone voted more, and this is, still a Republican state. And if you look around, this is a Republican state. That kind of makes sense for the most part, right? Depending where you look. And we still don't have enough voter participation to say for sure. But yeah, I think, I don't know. I've been here long enough to know whenever Democrats are like, this is the year. I'm like, well, I don't know, guys, we'll see. You've been saying that a long time. I mean, I don't think it's never going to happen, but I think it's always hard to say, in the short term, what things look like, because there's just so many variables.
I just want to echo what Ashley is saying and highlight again the fact that maybe if it wasn't the case in Texas, there were certainly other battleground states, not just, places like Georgia, but Arizona, where there had been this idea that this will be the year, and that had been building for several election cycles for Democrats there. And I think it came a bit to fruition, clearly, because, Biden won both of those states. And so I can see how that gives the space for that kind of, idea. But I think the other thing that's really important in terms of those variables, like Ashley noted, is that it comes down to what type of work Democrats are willing to put in terms of, outreach to communities that maybe haven't voted as often in previous election cycles. I'm thinking a little bit about not specifically just Latino voters, but Latinas. I've done a little bit of reporting on that in terms of the fact that they turned out extensively this election cycle and might have really helped contribute in key areas for Biden. But, how do you sustain that And I think there are Democratic organizers that will tell you that just the party needs to like treat every year like a presidential year, and not just have like a flood of money. Like there was a lot of conversation about just how much money was raised this election cycle in not just US Senate races, but in some of these state house investments. And if you put in all that money, you know, just a couple of months before the election, I think we're starting to see that's just not going to be enough. And so it's really a matter of how you use that money and how early you invest in candidates, especially women and women of color in the primary versus sort of the general.
I wonder.
Sandra, go ahead.
Maybe in 2022, we, in the Democratic Party, and I'm going to just speak for that because that's the party I'm in, that we look at the primaries and try to limit how many people run in the primary. I mean, if in order to save up the money that's necessary in order to beat candidates in the general election. As we do, the primaries are really expensive. Just a thought. I mean, I have no idea. Mostly we like to have more people competing than fewer. But there is something to be said for a focus early on.
Sandra Regona asked this question. She says, Ashley is leading me to believe there are more party voters than there are independent voters. Is this the case?
More people, yeah, well, yeah. Independent voters are always a smaller slice. It's a growing slice of the population, but yeah, I think most people vote brown, and even people who are independent more consistently vote for one party over the other. Yeah, this is the two-party system country. Like, until we don't have single-member districts and winner-take-all elections, it is going to be two parties, and for the most part, voters are going to split either way. I think, you know, it is a tough, if you're a moderate, like a true middle-of-the-road moderate, you know, this is a tough environment to find a lane, and I sympathize with voters who are true independents, but yeah, I mean, most people are party voters, right? I mean, I'm not, I don't have a political science PhD, just a BA, I guess. But yeah, that's kind of always been true.
Anybody else want to comment? Ann Withrow has a question. 2018 set up an expectation that there would be a linear improvement in 2020. Well, we weren't supposed to be this far along in flipping Texas blue so soon, right? What can we tell volunteers about what to realistically expect going forward? We worked so hard and barely held our ground. How can we motivate volunteers to put in the same level of effort for likely more incremental improvements?
Well, I think the volunteers should realize that I've said this earlier, that we only lost by 11,500 for all the races. They were very, very close. So your efforts did not go in vain. And having those close elections, I think, really mattered in the speaker's vote. I don't think that we would have had a speaker who reached out to the Democratic side as much as he did if the races would not have been that close.
Mary Cullinane asks, now that Republicans will be drawing the district lines for the next 10 years, what are the realistic chances that Democrats will be able to gain the majority before or even by 2030? Are we in for 10 more years of unmitigated Republican dominance in state government?
Well, elections matter. I won't try to kid you in that regard. Yep. There's just no doubt that having a Republican speaker who sits on that LRB board and they will be in charge of the lines, that we will not do better under redistricting. But how much worse we do is this tide will be stemmed by the fact that the increment is larger and it's harder to draw the lines where there are more Democrats than actually are, or where the seats are so competitively fought.
We're also not able to predict where people are going to in-migrate and where they're going to buy homes and then register to vote. We've seen the city, and I'm speaking specifically about how blue the cities, the urban areas in Texas have become. I've lived here since 77 and in Austin since 80. And there was a time when Dallas was, pretty Republican, and that has completely shifted. Same with Houston and Fort Worth shifted to Democratic in a large way this last election, if I'm remembering correctly. So, and with younger folks voting who have, they're the 9/11 generation and now a pandemic generation. I think they have more progressive values and more pragmatic, possibly as far as voters, and they will make a big difference too. So I think we just keep working away at it, keep chipping away at it. And I'm glad that Sheryl mentioned that the difference in the votes was only about 11,000. That's a really important number to keep in mind, I think. And that gets lost in the general discussion. In fact, that was a number I hadn't heard before. So I think that's really helpful. And it's enough to buoy people's spirits that there's always more work ahead of us. And we should be grateful that we're able to continue to do the work.
Yeah, and I mean, the trend line is pretty dramatic, right? If we look at just the general election for like the presidential race, Mitt Romney won by 16 points. Right. Trump the first time by 9, the second time by 6. I mean, that's a trend line. So general election wise, that there are gains if, volunteers are trying to glean some hope from what is otherwise, a lot of unsuccessful attempts. But I mean, this is more, I don't know if it's okay for me to pose a question to other panelists, but I'm actually curious to hear from Representative Cole. I mean, what are the odds? I'm personally, as someone who lives in Austin, I'm personally interested in whether, this could be the year that Austin finally gets an anchor district in Congress. We're the biggest city in America that doesn't have a district within its city lines. I mean, that's something that I'm very curious about as a local reporter. And the question is Democrats are obviously going to have a disadvantage during redistricting, but the question is how disadvantaged, and are there little wins in the margins? And that's one that I'm wondering for Democrats if.
Well, from what we hear about the census data, because of the increase in Central Texas, we'll probably have another seat. But how that seat will be drawn, we are not in charge of. And we know what they did to Congressman Lloyd Doggett. Right. So I really just think we have to concentrate on what Leslie has said and on making sure that we put pressure on the members that were under a lot of pressure in their election to not draw us out.
Could I just add to that? I think, again, from a sort of a national perspective, that there are a lot more people who are aware about the dynamics of redistricting and gerrymandering, and there have been instances in which courts have made decisions to help make them more fair. And so obviously there was a lot of focus on the 2010 election and its impact on state houses around the country in terms of those decision makings. And so it's easy to decide well, look what happened after 2010 and what does the next decade look like for state houses? But I feel like it's not quite the same given the focus that some courts have had. I'm thinking about places like Wisconsin and North Carolina, and I think that there's going to be a lot more conversation about whether there's nonpartisan approaches to redistricting. I think voters might have even had a say in some instances since, and I think the reason why I bring that point up too is just that the previous point about sort of voters or volunteers that might feel a bit maybe deflated post-election. I think one of the things that was really interesting, I've always been interested in a sort of ballot measures around the country. Obviously, it depends on the respective state in terms of what they allow in terms of voters being able to get something on the ballot or their respective state house being able to challenge something. But, there was, in Colorado, voters passed paid family leave. In the Portland, Oregon area, voters supported or approved universal pre-K. So I feel like And I mean, and this is true too for very kind of controversial issues over abortion access. You know, abortion was on the ballot actually this election cycle too. Colorado actually rejected some abortion restrictions. Louisiana added some on a constitutional amendment. I just think with the, again, potential for extended gridlock in Congress, this is also going to be a space where people raise their voices in terms of getting ballot measures on the ballot, and that could also extend to things like redistricting, at least in the future, but also just a wide range of issues.
Kurt Lockhart asks, looking ahead, what does the panel think the major issues will be in 2022 and 2024 in a hopefully post-Trump, post-pandemic world?
I think police issues will lead on that, and I think that has a long tail. Those are pretty complicated and multi-layered, and they won't be resolved even in next year. Most of our decisions on police funding happen during the city council budget work, but we gave direction to the city manager to reimagine and reshape how we do policing in Austin. And that will take a while for that to settle out, because that's a behavior change and that's a social change. But I see that as a very important action and wave going forward. And not just here in Texas, but they certainly have to work through it in Oregon and Washington and frankly all around the country.
Again, the long-term issues that won't go away in one session are definitely education and healthcare, and in particular the funding of education.
Yeah, I think with the pandemic is, even though it'll be gone, it will set the stage for whatever is coming next. I think the pandemic broke open a lot of underlying problems that the country has had and the state has had. I mean, a good example is like paid family leave, what Barbara mentioned. You know, that was something that I think the Trump White House had said they would work on. I think that was Ivanka's task, I guess, and that didn't happen. But, you know, during the pandemic, issues related to childcare and the division of labor as it relates to children and work. I mean, so many women have left the workforce because of the pandemic. These are issues that will have to be grappled with for years to come. I don't think that's something that's, you know, that's generations of improvement for women. That is just, and I'm sure Barbara can talk more eloquently about this than I can, because this is not my beat, but I imagine issues like that will have to be dealt with moving forward, because that's a pretty big intractable problem that we haven't seemed to solve in this country and other countries have. So, and in Texas, I'm assuming we're not immune to that. And yeah, I imagine the healthcare issue will be with us for a long time. Talk about a problem that was underlying has now been cracked open. Texas's uninsured problem and the racial disparities of, you know, in health are, you know, a huge problem that we're, you know, it was a problem when we were looking at maternal health statistics, and now a pandemic has just sort of showed us again that that is another problem that we have yet to successfully deal with.
I can add another one in here too. I think how we work and where we work, and the social constructs all around that, which feeds into the healthcare issue, the care for elders, the care for children, education, childcare. So how we work and where we work, and how cities, the structure of cities and our transportation systems, they're all going to kind of be stood on their heads too.
And I think I just wanted to add that, you know, another dynamic, you know, in the weeks leading up to the election was just the confirmation of Amy Coney Barrett to the US Supreme Court, which obviously further cemented the court's conservative leanings for generations, and not just the US Supreme Court, but other judicial appointments. And I think that that has implications for women in areas like healthcare and abortion and LGBTQ rights. And so I'm particularly interested in sort of seeing the ways in which, again, state houses are going to be on the front lines of deciding policy and sort of how that ends up before the courts. And obviously there's a lot of conversation about what impact that could have with, you know, abortion access, Roe v. Wade, you know, the Affordable Care Act. Obviously there's the sense that it could be gutted, though I think that there's also the sense that it might not be the case given the very recent hearing on the ACA. But, you know, I think that what happens when some of those bills that end up in state houses end up before more conservative judicial courts before the US Supreme Court. And so I think that raises a lot of questions in general. So yeah, I'm thinking a lot about some of those dynamics. And the other thing I wanted to mention before I forget, I brought it up a little bit sort of at the beginning of our panel, was just how much local offices, in terms of, I feel like the pandemic has had a huge impact on how people see the ways in which local government can work for them or not work for them. I've never seen such packed Zoom meetings for city council meetings since the pandemic. And so I feel like there were some, you know, major barriers broken during this election cycle, particularly for women and women of color. And some of them, a lot of them are Democrats, and they're going to have more progressive policies that are going to be kind of rolling out in communities around the country in a way that I'm not sure we've seen before, since there's been no one like them before in these spaces. And so I'm really curious to kind of see what conversations, you know, those bring up. Yeah, so.
I'll also add that I think there will be an increased dynamic in 22 and 24 about the push between local control and state control and federal control, but especially local versus state. We're starting to see that as a Democratic versus Republican, and I don't think that gridlock is going to change, and it will lead to issues needing to be decided.
I would like to take advantage of my position as question answerer to ask each of the panelists why that none of you mentioned climate change as a major issue.
I mean, I'll just note that climate change is a major issue. I think there's just so many other things that we were all talking about from the lens of the questions that were posed, but you know, it's certainly a massive issue and one that the new administration, the president-elect is dealing with and highlighting and made a point during the election. So I'm particularly curious to see how that then trickles down into the actions of state houses, governor's offices, local offices. You know, I think that there's been a lot of criticism about how President Trump has handled climate change over the last 4 years, but it's been focused on such a federal dynamic. But states like California have previously taken such a lead on addressing climate change that I think that there will be more pressure on states to do that, even with a new administration.
You know, oh, sorry, Cheryl, did you want to jump in?
Oh, go ahead.
Right after the election, I talked to my staff about bringing a resolution to, when we knew that Biden and Harris had won, to exhort them to rejoin the Paris Climate Accord. And right as I was talking with my chief of staff about drafting up that resolution, Biden made a statement that one of the 3 things we were going to do on January 20th was rejoin the Paris Climate Accord. And so I was pretty pleased about that. I think we still want to do a resolution that provides the support, obviously, but I also brought a resolution on the Green New Deal at the city of Austin, the climate crisis we recognized and are working towards climate resilience and community resilience are also 2 initiatives that I brought in the last year. And I have to say that at the city of Austin, I feel like to a large extent, we're kind of the low-hanging fruit with, in fact, all of the progressive issues, because this council and councils before, like the ones that my good friend Sheryl served on, were really tuned in to the values of this community, and we worked hard and overtime in order to express them in our legislation. And in some ways, I do get a little bit impatient with groups that come to Austin City Council and demand that we do something along the lines of what we are already doing. So they notice, which is as far as the level of research that goes into things. But the other thing is, yes, we will do that, and we are doing that, and we will continue to do that. But you need to work at the statewide level. You need to work in the fields that are harder to plow, with the trees whose limbs are higher, because it is actually, frankly, going to be serving everybody into the future much more sustainably if we can turn those folks who have this weird, there's that weird dynamic that we don't believe the science, or a woman doesn't get to make her own decisions for her own healthcare, even though the men get to. I will never understand that, and so forth and so on. And so locally, I feel like we're a cheap date sometimes. Because Austin knows where progressive politics are and where the progressive values are, and we live them every day. The harder row to hoe is at the state level and, frankly, at the national level. And I really would urge everybody who's really engaged and motivated and activated, we all need to be focusing, with the support of the city, obviously, in those, toward those fields that are not as far along the continuum as we all believe they should be.
Well, in being an expensive date, I will say that Texas is an oil and gas state. And I really think Biden's position on fracking really cut into his support in the state more than it has been reported. That being said, I do see progress on clean energy at the state level, especially wind farm energy, and those that are starting to benefit areas of the state, like rural counties, in a positive economic manner. And so I think we have some hope there.
Agree. We do have some hope.
Joanne has a question for Ashley. The U.S. House Central Texas districts are so gerrymandered that being a progressive candidate doesn't translate well in these districts. Can you comment on that?
Yeah. I mean, like I said earlier, Democrats are really disadvantaged in a lot of districts. I mean, Austin is a very unique situation in that I consider 6 districts touch the Austin area, or at least the Travis County area. That's and only 5 are and only 1 is represented by a Democrat, 5 are represented by Republicans. Like, that is the result of, Republicans having the steering wheel when, political maps are drawn, which is, I guess why it's not overly like doom and gloom to say it's unlikely Democrats will win a bunch of congressional seats in the next 10 years. But yeah, I mean, the conversation of whether it is more helpful to be a progressive or a moderate Democrat in any seat is not a conversation that, I leave that to politicians because they run elections and they know better what each district is like. That is a fight that is going on right now. I've been fascinated by Connell Lamb and AOC duking it out over whether, what the path is forward. We still don't have enough data to say, where it was that Democrats underperformed and, the congressional seats that the DCCC set their sights on here in Central Texas. But yeah, I'm more interested in what Democrats have to say about that, what they think. Especially Democrats who win elections, right? Like what they think is the secret sauce. I don't really know. I think I kind of listen to both sides, and I see merits to both arguments. Yeah, I don't have a better answer.
If I may interject on this point too, one thing that I'm thinking a lot about and sort of what effect that has on my coverage in the future is the level, again, of misinformation and disinformation related to the election, the ways in which it was used against different different candidates, not just the presidential election. I think this is part of where this conversation is coming about, whether, certain dynamics like, defund the police, or the conversation over, what it means to have progressive policies that would be viewed as, socialism. And this was a conversation that really came up in places like South Florida, where I'm actually originally from, in terms of disinformation for Latino voters. And I don't know that we have the extent of that operation of sorts, in terms of how it's playing out in spaces like Facebook and Twitter. And I think that, I just wanted to throw that out there, because I think we as reporters are still sorting out in what ways we, correct the record, what is the abilities that we have to correct the record, given our limitations with literally furloughs and pay cuts and job loss, and that's complicated. And I think it has an effect, though, on how people perceive some of the elections too. And so just wanted to throw that little wrench in there too, because it's all complicated.
Yeah, and I want to call back to a point I made earlier. Like, we do have a model for like how Democrats do well statewide, and I think that was Beto O'Rourke. He lost, but that was probably the closest election we've had here. And the biggest difference between the way he ran and, I would say most other Democrats, and a lot of this is because of the pandemic, is they didn't knock on as many doors. They didn't do it. They just couldn't do as much as he did. That was a lot of money, a lot of time, a lot of handshaking. Like, it's harder in Texas to win. It just is. Not just because of redistricting. It's been a historically red state for a long time, and that takes a lot of work, a lot of persuasion, a lot of money to change. So, and on the different district levels that you're asking about, Joanne, it's hard to see, without having, I guess, just like better data at this point. But I would say, like, when I look at like, okay, how can Democrats close in the margins? Like, that's an example that I saw that worked. It was just a lot of work.
Question from Dan Eckham. What do you make of exit polls showing that Trump increased his vote share among Blacks and Hispanics relative to 2016?
Man, I have no answer to that. I am as puzzled as maybe anybody else. Gobsmacked.
I can talk about Latino voters. Like Barbara, I am from South Florida, so I grew up around a lot of Latino Republicans, like my whole family. Different parts of Texas have historically, like those Latino communities have historically voted for Republicans. And I think the fact that immigration wasn't front and center this time around was really helpful to Republicans. That is, again, a gut check. We don't have enough data. I just want to preface that, we can't say for sure, but my gut check is that I think, we didn't have, ongoing conversations about family separation, which was surprising to me during the last few months of the election. Immigration was not front and center. Trump wasn't focusing as much on immigration as he did during his first go around. And I think that helped in parts of Texas. And the economy was a big one too. We're seeing some anecdotal reporting coming out of the RGV that, Latino businesses are having a really hard time, frankly, because governments, federal and state, haven't done enough to, help them out during all of this. And so the conversations around lockdowns, even though probably the proper public health choice is spells economic ruin for a lot of people. And when you are already a vulnerable population, which a lot of Latinos are in the state, that is a really scary thing. And I think, there was not enough of a nuanced conversation maybe coming from Democrats. And again, probably because they just weren't able to do as much work and as much, person to person talking as they were in the past. That's my gut check. This is a place, Texas is a place where 30%, 40% of Latino voters who turn out have voted for Republicans in the past. So I think maybe 2016 was a weird year. And this looks more like in Texas, what it usually looks like. And again, just their voting, I wonder how much it's just also voting brand, because immigration wasn't as big as an issue. They didn't feel as bad voting brand again, for Republicans. So, but we'll see. Those are my sort of gut reactions to.
I'll comment on the Black vote and then the Hispanic vote. The margin of increase in the Black vote for Trump was so small that it doesn't deserve to be looked at as a major change or issue. And then the difference between how Black women supported the Democratic ticket as opposed to Black men tells another story that I think goes to part of the Hispanic issue, which is the economy. When we were perceived as being detrimental to COVID and not opening up the economy or keeping it open, that affects a lot of low-wage jobs. And in a situation where you have to make a choice between even a disease that you might get and not being able to pay your rent and putting your family on kicked out, so to speak, those kind of economic issues are real, and you vote your self-interest. And then I'll also say something we see in the legislature all the time. A lot of the Hispanic population is Catholic, and they simply don't support our pro-choice view of the world. And as that bubbles to the top of a value, when you say things like family values, that really does resonate with a lot of the Hispanic population, especially in South Texas. And then finally, I don't think that the criminal justice issues that were in play that did hold the Black community, but it didn't motivate as much the Hispanic community, because so many Hispanics, especially in South Texas, are actually in law enforcement. So when we think about immigration issues, we usually think of the Hispanic community as being totally against a lot of the Trump policies of building the wall and making it harder for people to migrate into the state. But also we neglect the number of Hispanics who are involved in law enforcement.
And if I might just add to that point, I just want to make clear, and I know that everyone knows this, or hopefully everyone knows that, the Latino vote is not monolithic, and it never has been. It's just, it's maybe misunderstood depending on what region of the country we're talking about. And there has not been enough investment in understanding Latino voters expansively, despite the fact that they have such political power in terms of as a voting bloc, but not necessarily because they're all going to vote the same way. And so I think 2020 will prove to be a year where there has just, the parties in the future will have to do a lot more investment in sorting out how they talk to Latino voters. And on the same front, even with immigration, really the pandemic has had a huge impact on the conversation over the economy. Latino women were most impacted, among the most impacted in terms of job loss. And so I just think, yeah, like and to the point that Sheryl made, like the numbers are still getting sorted out, but in terms of the Black vote, in terms of Black men, like it is a pretty minuscule number. And even with Latino voters, I still think that the bigger picture question that needs to be asked is why white voters still voted for President Trump in such large numbers, because ultimately they are the ones that helped make it a lot closer of a race than a lot of people thought it would be. And so I think that the direction or the narrative still needs to focus on white voters.
I agree with that. And I think that Trump taps into this kind of atavistic, instinctual thing that's in people that hasn't been civilized yet or something, because it seems to come out in some pretty horrible ways. And we're definitely seeing that now with the people who are convinced that the election was stolen from him. And when I said earlier, I was kind of worried and a little bit scared about what may happen in the next couple of years. In the next couple of months and into January, February, I going to be watching really carefully and hoping that the better angels, people's better angels, will win out that war, because it does seem like there's some very, well, I said atavistic, just kind of primordial sort of beliefs that people are acting on, and they seem to lose their common sense, their better sense. Certainly, it's not very civil behavior, and that leads to pretty major tearing of society. And I think that Trump did that. I think that when I said earlier in my opening remarks that he has a lot to answer for, his predations and depredations, that's what I'm talking about.
Thanks. This
I
panel
don't understand it.
certainly.
I'll just end up by saying, I don't understand it.
Yeah.
I can see it, but I don't understand the roots of it, and why people are behaving the way they are.
Thanks. We certainly have no trouble here drawing discussions and comments out of this panel. We are running over. Ham, is there a chance for one more question?
One more question. Dave Jones asks Representative Cole, does she have any sense of how partisan Speaker Phelan will be on redistricting? Will Democrats be able to extract some partisan concessions other than simply protecting Democratic incumbent legislators' districts?
Well, he was elected in the early round, about 50 Republicans and 30 Democrats. So he already has a significant amount of his support from the Democratic Party, and that happened early on. So I think that the Democrats will be very influential in how he decides to govern on the major issues. Now, redistricting is another matter, because it takes on a political tornado of its own. And so to what extent he will be involved in actually protecting Democratic seats that aren't incumbents, or even that incumbents actually have an advantage, we just simply don't know yet.
Okay, well, I want to take time to thank our panel members here. It was a wonderful discussion. I know that Zoom meetings tend to get tiring if they drag on much more than a little over an hour. So if we were meeting in person, we could have great discussions afterwards, one-on-one with the people, but unfortunately we can't do that yet. At some point we will. But again, I just happened to notice that all 4 of our panel members are women. That is another indication of the way things are changing in this nation. Who knows, after Biden's presidency, the next presidency has a good chance of being also a woman. So with that, I remind people to look for the notices on our special December meeting, where we'll have a TED Talk, very interesting TED Talk, and a group discussion afterwards. Joanne, is there anything else you'd like to say in closing this out?
No, I'd just like to thank all those folks who were in the audience, and especially thanks the participants who were from all over and were able to help us understand and all of the different levels of government and what we're, I wouldn't say up against, but look forward to in the next year to 2 years. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.